It was just past noon when Damon Walker stepped off the curb and onto the wide, glistening sidewalk of the downtown district. The sun bounced off the glass facades of high-rises, and the air was thick with the familiar buzz of city life. Honking horns, hurried conversations, and the occasional hum of distant sirens. Dressed in faded jeans, a worn utility jacket with a construction company's patch on the sleeve, and steel-toed boots streaked with dried mud, Damon didn't match the surrounding crowd. Businessmen in sharp suits brushed past him without a glance. Women in heels and silk moved around him like water around a stone. He carried a folded blueprint in one hand, tucked beneath his arm like a second thought, and with the other he wiped the sweat from his brow. He wasn't dirty, just real. A man coming off a long morning's work, his clothes telling the story of labor, not laziness. He paused outside a sleek upscale restaurant, a place with minimalist gold lettering on the glass, and a maitre d' station that looked more like an art installation than a podium. Inside, through the crystal-clear windows, well-dressed patrons sipped wine and laughed quietly at private jokes. White linen tablecloths glowed in the sunlight. Waiters moved like dancers, perfectly timed and silent. Damon took a breath, smoothed down the front of his vest, and walked inside with a nod to the greeter by the door. As soon as he stepped into the cool, air-conditioned space, the tone of the room shifted just slightly. Nothing loud, no gasps, just a pause, a stutter in the rhythm. One man glanced up from his menu, eyebrows raised. A woman leaned over and whispered to her friend, eyes darting toward Damon's boots. Behind the front desk, a young hostess, no older than 22, straightened up from her phone and blinked in confusion. Damon, unfazed, offered her a polite smile. "Good afternoon," he said calmly, voice low and respectful. "Table for one, please." The hostess hesitated. Her eyes moved from his jacket to his boots, to the slight dust still clinging to his sleeves. She forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sir, do you have a reservation?" "No, I figured I'd try my luck. I've eaten here before," he replied, still calm, still smiling. She glanced toward the back, where a manager stood talking to a server. The unspoken message in her hesitation was clear. Damon didn't look like the kind of man who just wandered into places like this for lunch. Not dressed like that. Not without a suit. "I'm sorry, sir," she said finally. "We have a dress code. Business casual at minimum." Damon nodded slowly, his expression unchanged. He didn't argue, didn't ask for the manager, didn't raise his voice. He looked past her, into the dining area, at the people who now deliberately avoided his gaze. Then he met her eyes again and simply said, "No problem, have a nice day." He turned and walked out with the same quiet dignity he had come in with. The door shut behind him with a soft click. No one followed, no one apologized. Inside, the music continued, the forks clinked against porcelain, and the city's most polite prejudice settled back into place as if nothing had happened. Outside, Damon stood still for a moment. Then, with a faint smile, more to himself than anyone else, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. One message sat waiting. "Meeting confirmed. Investor review at 2 p.m. He tapped out a reply, took one last look at the building behind him, and walked down the street, not defeated, but thoughtful, calm, silent, waiting, because they had no idea who he was. Yet, it wasn't even 5 minutes later when Damon returned. He hadn't gone far, just around the corner to a quiet bench near a bus stop where he could gather his thoughts. He hadn't been angry, not exactly, more disappointed than anything. Not at the hostess, not even at the restaurant. He was disappointed at how unsurprising the moment had been. He'd seen the look before, heard the polite rejection masked behind rules and policies, behind dress codes and reservations that didn't apply to everyone equally. But still, it stung. Even when you expect the slap, it still leaves a mark. He stood up slowly, straightened his jacket again. Not because he expected a different result, but because dignity wasn't about how others treated you. It was about how you carried yourself despite it. He walked back inside with the same calm, deliberate step. The same man, same clothes, same quiet confidence. This time, the hostess wasn't alone. The restaurant manager had come to the front. A man in his late 40s with slicked-back hair, a tailored blazer, and an air of superiority that entered the room 10 seconds before he did. He stood behind the hostess with crossed arms, watching Damon approach like a bouncer at a nightclub. Before Damon could speak, the manager stepped forward, his smile more cutting than kind. "I believe my colleague already informed you we have a dress code, sir." Damon nodded, unfazed. "She did. I just wanted to speak to someone about that. Maybe clarify," but the manager didn't let him finish. "I'm afraid there's nothing to clarify. This establishment maintains a certain standard. And unfortunately," he said, glancing once more at Damon's work boots with clear distaste, "you don't meet it." The words hit the air like cold metal. Sharp, final, a silence hung between them for a moment. Damon looked the manager in the eye. Not challenging, not aggressive, just calmly, evenly. "I'm a paying customer. Just wanted a meal." "And we're within our rights to refuse service," the manager replied quickly, as if the line had been practiced. "Now, unless you're here on official business, like delivery, you'll need to leave." For the first time, Damon's expression shifted just slightly. Not anger, still, but something behind his eyes cooled, focused, measured. "I'm not here on delivery," he said quietly. The manager smiled with smug satisfaction. "Then I'm going to have to ask you to step outside. Now." A couple sitting nearby glanced over, unsure whether to keep sipping their wine or get out their phones. One waiter had paused mid-step, unsure whether to keep walking. The room, like before, didn't explode. It just froze. Slightly. Just enough to feel it. Damon didn't move right away. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he reached slowly into his back pocket and pulled out a simple leather wallet. From it, he retrieved a plain white business card. No logo, no flair, just a name, a phone number, and one line in clean black print. Damon Walker, Principal, Walker Equity Group. He held it out to the manager, who didn't take it. Just looked at it with vague confusion and distrust, as if it might explode in his hand. "Not interested," the manager said flatly, "and I'd like you to leave, before I call someone who'll make you." Damon looked down at the card, then tucked it away again, not missing a beat. He nodded once, just slightly, then turned and walked out. Again. No anger in his step, no slump in his shoulders. But this time, the cameras outside the building caught him leaving. Not as a customer turned away, but as a man returning to his property. Inside, the restaurant manager muttered something to the hostess, probably about people like that, thinking they could just walk into places they didn't belong. And that's what stuck with Damon as he stepped back into the sunlight. That phrase, that feeling. People like that. It echoed in his chest, not as a wound, but as fuel. The city always looked different from above. Not just taller, wider, more alive, more understandable. Damon stood at the edge of a rooftop garden, 5 blocks from the restaurant, hands resting on the glass railing, looking out at the skyline with a stillness that came only from deep, earned patience. From here, the world didn't judge his boots or his jacket. From here, the city was a living blueprint, and Damon had helped design more of it than most of the men who wore the suits that ignored him. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows looked into a sleek office space, neutral wood tones, polished steel desks, and sketches pinned to walls like trophies. Framed photographs lined the hallway inside. Groundbreaking ceremonies, ribbon cuttings, architecture awards. And in more than half of them stood Damon, sometimes in a suit, sometimes in that same weathered jacket, but always in the center, always the anchor. He walked inside and shrugged off the jacket, revealing a crisp polo underneath. Still practical, still him. The receptionist looked up from her desk with a respectful nod, used to his rhythm. "Mr. Walker," she said warmly, "your 2 p.m. is waiting in conference room 2. He nodded in thanks but didn't head there yet. Instead, he turned down a hallway and paused by a wall covered in renderings. High-rises, mixed-use developments, green buildings with energy-neutral systems, and, most relevant of all, a 10-year-old printout labeled Wilford Plaza, Concept Phase. Below it, a list of investors and stakeholders. At the very top, Walker Equity Group, and right underneath, Primary Project Lead, Damon Walker. He stared at it for a moment, not in pride, not even in anger, but with the precision of a man revisiting a decision. He remembered the pitch meeting. He remembered standing in that same conference room, convincing billionaires that the dilapidated corner of Wilford and Ninth could become a hub of commerce and beauty. They hadn't believed in the location, but they had believed in him, because he believed in his vision more than they feared their risk. And now that vision stood 3 stories tall, draped in polished stone, and filled with boutique shops, tech offices, and, yes, a restaurant that had just kicked out the man who'd made it all possible. He took a deep breath, checked his watch, and finally walked into the conference room. Inside sat 3 men in suits, all younger than him, but dressed to appear older. Analysts, probably, or junior partners. They stood when he entered. "Mr. Walker," one said, offering a firm handshake. "Thanks for meeting on short notice." "Not a problem," Damon replied, gesturing for them to sit. "What's the update on Wilford Plaza?" The man in the center, clearly the lead, opened his laptop. "Everything's performing above projections. Tenants are stable. Foot traffic up 12% since last quarter. The only flag, minor, but something to note, is the Garrow," he said, referring to the restaurant. "We've received 2 complaints about management this month. One internal, one from a tenant next door about an incident. No details yet." Damon gave a small, knowing nod and leaned back in his chair. "You'll have more details soon." The younger man blinked, confused. "Sorry?" "Don't worry about it," Damon said, his voice calm and level. "Just keep the file open. I'll handle it personally." There was a pause. The air in the room shifted slightly, as if everyone had just realized something had moved beneath the surface. Something slow, something with weight. Damon stood again, straightened his collar, and walked back toward the windows. He looked out across the city, not lost in thought, but sharpening one. They hadn't just turned away a customer. They'd disrespected an owner, an investor, a builder of the very floor they were standing on. And the foundation he built had no room for arrogance dressed as professionalism. Not anymore. The office was quiet, the kind of quiet that only came late in the afternoon when meetings were over and the clatter of keyboards had finally stilled. A soft hum of ambient music played low in the background, jazz without words, more to fill the space than to be heard. The sun had begun to tilt west, casting a warm amber glow across the hardwood floor of Damon's private office. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline like art. From here, the city didn't intimidate. It listened. Damon sat at the head of a long table, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a laptop open in front of him, though he wasn't looking at it. His eyes were fixed on the tablet in his hands, swiping through a digital lease portfolio. Every tenant in Wilford Plaza, every square foot, every clause and signature. His finger hovered over the line labeled The Garrow Restaurant Group, Commercial Lease Agreement, Suite 1A. It had been renewed last year. 5-year term, premium location, above market rate, a good client on paper. But the numbers didn't tell the full story. Not today. The screen on the wall lit up as the conference call connected. 4 other faces blinked to life. 3 men, 1 woman, all in different cities, time zones, and moods. These were Damon's fellow partners at Walker Equity Group. Not just investors, builders, quiet titans, the kind of people whose wealth didn't scream but simply moved things. "Afternoon, everyone," Damon said, voice calm but direct. "I want to bring something to the table that's not in our quarterly reports." A few polite nods. One of the men adjusted his tie and replied, "We figured. This wasn't on the schedule." "It's about the Garrow. And something that happened today," Damon continued, his tone even, controlled, but with a deliberate edge that only those who knew him well would notice. "I went there for lunch. Walked in, dressed as I am most days, sightwear, nothing flashy. I didn't have a reservation. And I was asked to leave. Not once, twice, publicly, not because of crowding, not because of service limitations, and certainly not because of my behavior." He let that settle for a moment. On the screen, the woman raised an eyebrow, slowly leaning back in her chair. The others remained silent, processing the implications. "So you're saying they didn't recognize you," she said, more as a statement than a question. "No," Damon replied. "They didn't even see me. And that's the real issue." Another partner chimed in. "You think it's worth escalating? From a business standpoint, they've been strong performers. No late rent. Good customer flow." Damon closed the tablet gently and placed it on the table. Then he folded his hands and looked directly at the camera. "I'm not talking about numbers. I'm talking about values. About what we've said from the beginning, that we invest in spaces that serve the public, that represent a future we believe in. This building bears our name on every legal document, and I will not allow any business under our roof to treat people like that, whether it's me or someone without a title. Because if they can do it to me, dressed like a worker, imagine how they treat people who don't own half the block." Silence again, but not resistance. Just thought. A kind of stillness that came when power reoriented itself in the room. Finally, the woman nodded. "You want to pull the lease?" "Not yet," Damon said. "I want a conversation first. But it's going to be on my terms. Face to face. If they hear the message and take it seriously, we go forward. If they deflect, or dismiss, or worse, then yes, we begin termination proceedings." "And what if they push back?" another asked. Damon leaned back slightly, his voice calm and absolute. "Then we show them how ownership actually works." There were no further objections. The partners agreed to let him handle it personally, to trust his judgment, something they'd learned to do over years of watching Damon turn dirt lots into city blocks and vision into legacy. The call ended with polite goodbyes and scheduled follow-ups, but the air in Damon's office lingered with something heavier. Not rage, not revenge, purpose. He closed the laptop, stood, and walked to the window once more. From here, he could see the top of the Garrow's patio umbrellas, tiny and neat below, as if they belonged to a dollhouse rather than a business that had just made the kind of mistake it wouldn't soon forget. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just nodded once, to no one in particular. The conversation was over. Now it was time to speak in actions. The next day arrived with a crispness in the air that hadn't been there the day before. The city moved with its usual urgency, but for Damon Walker, the rhythm had slowed. Not from hesitation, but from precision. Everything he did that morning was deliberate. The dark charcoal suit he chose wasn't flashy, but it fit him with the kind of quiet authority that money couldn't buy and arrogance couldn't fake. He knotted his tie with practiced ease, slipped a silver watch over his wrist, and placed a single sheet of paper into a slim leather folder. No logo, no brand, just the documents he needed, and the weight of knowing exactly what he was walking into. This wasn't revenge. This was correction. By the time he stepped out of the back seat of a black electric sedan, the street outside the Garrow was already filling with the usual business lunch crowd. Attorneys, consultants, and executives who dressed like success was an obligation. Damon stepped out quietly, the valet barely acknowledging him at first, until he opened the door and caught a flash of the man's face. Recognition without understanding. Damon gave a polite nod, then turned and made his way to the entrance. Inside, nothing had changed. The same string music floated gently from the speakers. The same smell of truffle oil and seared meat lingered in the air. The same hostess, the one who had dismissed him less than 24 hours earlier, was back at her post, scanning the reservation list on her screen. When she looked up and saw him this time, her posture straightened instantly. There was a flicker of confusion in her eyes, a sense that she had seen this man before, but couldn't place the memory, or didn't want to. "Good afternoon, sir," she said quickly, her tone bright but forced. "Do you have a reservation?" Damon didn't answer her question. He simply reached into the inside pocket of his suit and handed her a business card. This time, it wasn't the plain one. It was embossed, sharp, with a gold-trimmed edge that whispered status before a word was read. She glanced at it, and her expression changed. Not just confusion now, fear. She looked up at him again, her voice catching in her throat. "Mr. Walker, one moment, please." She disappeared into the back, and within seconds, the restaurant manager emerged. The same man, same smug blazer, but this time there was no smile, only pale surprise and an awkward attempt to hide it. "Mr. Walker," he began, extending a hand that Damon didn't take. "We weren't expecting—" "No," Damon interrupted, his voice calm but commanding. "You weren't." The manager shifted his weight, his face already beginning to perspire slightly beneath the restaurant's controlled lighting. "Please, if there's anything I can do, perhaps a private table, lunch on the house, of course. It was all a misunderstanding." Damon raised an eyebrow, slowly, as if he were studying a blueprint and finding it deeply flawed. "Misunderstanding," he said. "Yesterday, I walked in here for lunch. You refused me service. Twice. Publicly. Because I didn't look like your kind of customer. Because I wore work boots instead of a tie." The manager opened his mouth, but Damon lifted a hand, not to silence him, but to make it clear he wouldn't be interrupted. "You didn't ask my name. You didn't ask what I wanted. You made assumptions based on a uniform that built this city. That pays your rent. Literally." He opened the folder and took out the lease agreement, laying it carefully on the hostess stand. His tone never rose, but it grew heavier with every word. "This restaurant exists because my firm developed this building, because I believed in a vision for a better downtown. And part of that vision did not include elitism disguised as standards." The room around them had grown quiet. A few guests nearby tried to appear disinterested, but their eyes flicked between forks and glances, clearly eavesdropping. Staff froze mid-step, unsure whether to intervene or disappear. Damon continued, now speaking clearly enough for anyone within 10 feet to hear. "I don't need an apology meal. I don't want a table. I came here to make something clear. You're not just serving food in someone else's building, you're operating in a space made possible by the very people you treat like outsiders." The manager, now visibly sweating, reached out toward the contract. "Mr. Walker, please." Damon took a step back. "Expect a call. The lease will be reviewed. Your investors will be contacted. You may want to begin considering other options." And with that, he turned. Not dramatically, not slowly, just with purpose. The same way he had walked out the day before, but this time leaving behind silence, consequence, and the undeniable weight of truth. The door closed softly behind him, but inside the restaurant nothing felt the same. Because power had walked in, and this time it didn't need to shout. By the next afternoon, word had already begun to circulate. Not publicly, not in headlines, but in whispers, among business circles, hospitality forums, and real estate management chats. Something had happened at the Garrow. Something significant enough that the building's owner had personally visited the premises. That alone was enough to stir quiet panic. But what followed was what truly made the staff nervous. Damon Walker was coming back, and this time it wouldn't be a surprise. At 3 p.m. sharp, Damon entered the restaurant again. Not as a guest, not as a man seeking justice, but as a landlord conducting business. He didn't come alone. With him was a calm, composed woman in a tailored navy pantsuit, his legal counsel, and a tall man in business casual attire with a clipboard in hand, the property's facilities liaison. They walked through the restaurant without being stopped. There was no hostess to intercept them this time. The manager had clearly instructed staff to stay clear. The same man, now pale, his confidence shaken, met Damon at the center of the dining area, near the empty table that had been hastily prepared in anticipation. But Damon didn't sit. He didn't even glance at the table. Instead, he looked around the room, taking in the eyes now turned toward him. Customers, staff, kitchen workers peeking from behind swinging doors. Everyone could feel the shift in the air. "I'm not here for a meal," Damon said, addressing the manager directly, but his voice was just loud enough to carry through the room without needing to be raised. "I'm here because what happened 2 days ago wasn't just offensive. It was symptomatic." The manager swallowed hard, his usual smoothness replaced by stiffness. Damon continued, not accusing but educating, firm, unshakable, the way a professor might speak to a room of students during a difficult lesson. "You judged me because I wore boots, because I had dirt under my fingernails from actual work, because I didn't fit the profile of who you thought belonged in this space. You didn't ask questions, you didn't engage, you dismissed. And I assure you, if I was just a man walking in for lunch, that would be bad enough. But I'm not just any man. I'm the person whose firm owns this building, whose signature is on the development plans, whose investment keeps this property standing." His words cut through the artificial calm of the restaurant like a scalpel. Precise, not violent. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, no longer pretending not to listen. One waiter froze mid-pour, holding a bottle of wine just above a glass. Damon turned slightly, his eyes now moving beyond the manager, addressing everyone who could hear him. "You see, this isn't about me anymore. It's about what it means to create spaces in a city that are truly open. It's about how we treat people when we think no one's watching, how we treat them when we assume they have nothing to offer us, and it's about what we do when we find out we were wrong." He stepped aside so that his lawyer could place a formal notice on the front podium. It wasn't a termination. Not yet. It was a written citation, a breach of lease protocol under a clause rarely enforced but very real, ethical conduct and inclusivity standards, tied to investor policy and tenant behavior. A copy was handed to the manager, who took it with a trembling hand. He opened his mouth, perhaps to object, to apologize, to justify, but Damon was already moving past him, walking toward the front entrance. At the threshold he paused once more, turning only slightly. This building was designed to be a space for progress. If you want to stay in it, you need to catch up. Then he walked out. The door didn't slam. The street noise didn't interrupt the moment. But inside the garrow, a silence settled that would not lift quickly. Conversations didn't resume right away. Staff didn't return to routine. The patrons looked at one another, then back toward the door, all acutely aware that something had just shifted. Not just in that room, but in the foundation beneath it. A lesson had been delivered, not in anger, not in revenge, but in truth. And everyone had heard it. The fallout didn't happen all at once. It never does in these kinds of stories. It began quietly, like a hairline crack in glass, barely visible at first, but spreading with every passing hour. By the end of the week, whispers had turned into questions, and questions had turned into formal emails. The Garrow's corporate headquarters received a notice from Walker Equity Group requesting a performance review meeting. It wasn't framed as disciplinary. Not yet. It was businesslike, neutral, and composed. But the subtext was crystal clear. Something was wrong, and it was no longer just a local issue. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere changed tangibly. The once confident manager now operated in a state of nervous restraint. He was no longer seen gliding across the floor with that smug ease. Instead, He stayed mostly behind the scenes, glued to his office, taking phone calls that ended with long silences and tired sighs. Staff members, who had once parroted his aloof professionalism, now operated with a quiet discomfort. They had seen the public dressing down. They had heard every word. And more importantly, they had felt the shift in tone, the removal of assumed power, the exposure of weakness behind a polished image. Some employees began reflecting on how they had treated customers before. One young hostess, who had watched the entire confrontation with Damon from a distance, started greeting guests differently. Her voice softened. She looked people in the eyes. Her smiles became real. The shift wasn't just fear, it was awareness. Because once you witness a system being challenged from the inside, you can't unsee it. The Garrow's Yelp and Google listings saw a spike, not from anything Damon had done, but from customers who had witnessed or heard of the incident. Reviews began mentioning the owner who stood up to prejudice and the guy in the boots who built the building. One guest even posted a selfie captioned, "Came to the Garrow to see where Damon Walker gave them a lesson in humility. Best coffee I've ever sipped." It wasn't a PR nightmare. It was a slow unraveling of a culture too comfortable in its own illusion of exclusivity. 2 weeks later, Walker Equity Group sent a final notice. Not an eviction, but a formal proposal. Restructure the management of the restaurant, implement updated staff training in inclusivity and bias awareness, and issue a public statement, acknowledging the incident, not as a scandal, but as a learning opportunity. It was more than fair. It was generous. But the Garrow's corporate board, disconnected and proud, declined the offer, believing the issue would blow over. They miscalculated. Within days, a new development company, friendly with Damon and long interested in the prime location, entered into talks with Walker Equity. Plans were drafted, proposals were exchanged, and by the end of the month, the restaurant space at Suite 1A was vacated. The lease legally terminated under clause conditions clearly outlined and fairly applied. The building didn't suffer. Quite the opposite. Damon quickly brought in a new tenant, a modern, community-centered cafe co-owned by a local black chef and a Latinx entrepreneur. Their mission was focused on inclusion, affordable fine dining, and open hiring practices. Within weeks, the space was transformed. New lighting, new colors, new life. And most importantly, new energy. When the new cafe opened, Damon didn't attend the ribbon-cutting ceremony as a guest of honor. He attended quietly, sitting near the back, wearing his work jacket and boots again. He greeted the staff with warmth, not authority. He ordered a black coffee and a turkey sandwich, and paid in cash, tipping generously. When the barista realized who he was, her eyes widened, but Damon simply smiled and said, "I'm just here to eat." Meanwhile, the former manager of the Garrow was now working as a shift supervisor at a chain restaurant in a different part of town. His LinkedIn profile remained silent on the details. His tone was more humble in interviews now, more rehearsed. Life hadn't fallen apart, but it had changed. Because consequences don't always come as punishments. Sometimes they come as lessons you carry with you into every room after the one you were forced to leave. Weeks had passed, but the story continued to ripple outward, not in dramatic headlines or viral outrage, but in quiet conversations that unfolded in classrooms, in cafes, and in business meetings where the name Damon Walker was now spoken with a mix of respect, curiosity, and a hint of awe. What he had done wasn't revolutionary in the loud, chaotic sense. There were no lawsuits filed, no protests staged, no headlines screaming injustice. And yet, for those who were paying attention, it was a lesson far more lasting, because it didn't just reveal a problem. It revealed a different way of responding to it. At the local university where Damon occasionally lectured, a student group invited him to speak. The invite had come with little fanfare, just a short email from a senior in the urban development program who wrote, We heard what happened. We want to learn from someone who acts when most people talk. Damon didn't immediately accept. He wasn't a man who liked spotlights, but something about the phrasing, acts when most people talk, had stayed with him. So, on a Friday afternoon, in a small auditorium filled with architecture students, business majors, and a few curious faculty members, Damon Walker stepped onto the stage, not in a suit, not even in his work vest, but in a simple black sweater and slacks, dressed like someone who could walk through any door without setting off alarms or assumptions. He didn't bring slides, no flashy graphics or inspirational slogans. He brought only himself and a single image projected behind him, a photo of Wilford Plaza on opening day, cranes still in the background, the future still being built. He spoke not of revenge, not of humiliation, but of structure, of systems, of foundations, both literal and cultural. He spoke of how cities are not just designed, they are inherited, shaped, and passed down, and how the people who build them are often the first to be pushed out of the very spaces they make possible. He told them about the Garrow, not as a scandal, but as an equation, a test of values, a moment when principle was weighed against convenience. And he told them what happens when the equation is corrected. What you tolerate, he said, his voice even but resonant, you reinforce. What you allow in silence, you build into the walls. And one day, when those walls turn cold and unwelcoming, you'll wonder how they got that way. It starts with a glance, a comment, a refusal to serve someone who doesn't look like you expect them to. It starts with a small decision to say nothing, and it ends with a building full of ghosts. The room was silent, not the kind of silence that comes from boredom, but the kind that holds weight, the kind that settles into your bones. A professor near the back had leaned forward, elbows on knees, his eyes narrowed in thought. A student in the front row, previously fidgeting with her phone, now held a pen poised above a notebook, motionless. Damon paused for a moment, then added one last thing. They kicked me out, he said, not because I was loud or disrespectful or disruptive, but because I didn't look like someone who belonged. And they were right, in a way. I didn't belong in that mindset. I don't belong in spaces built on exclusion. But I do belong in the conversation about what we build next. And so do you. He stepped down from the podium to quiet applause. Not a thunderous standing ovation, but something slower, more thoughtful. The kind of applause that follows when people don't just agree, but understand. Later that evening, Damon walked alone through the plaza he had once dreamed into existence. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the walkways. Lights flickered on behind the windows of the new cafe, where laughter now replaced silence, and the scent of fresh bread filled the air. He paused for a moment, watching a child tug at her mother's hand near the fountain, her small voice echoing with joy. This place felt different now, not just polished, but alive. He sat on a nearby bench, hands resting on his knees, and looked up at the building. There was no plaque with his name on it, no statue, no spotlight, but he didn't need any of that. He knew what he had built. More importantly, he knew how he had built it, with values, with vision, and with a kind of quiet, unshakable truth that refused to be chained by anyone's expectations. And as the sky darkened above him and the city moved on around him, Damon Walker sat still, not as a man who had won, but as a man who had corrected the course. And sometimes, that's the most powerful thing a person can do.